since the Ottoman armies sat at the gates of Vienna. That alliance collapsed amid acrimony, but Western apprehension continued, with the main focus of dread shifting periodically from one to the other of the two former allies. For a few years following the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Soviet Union was viewed with a degree of indulgence as China plunged into the xenophobic frenzy of the Cultural Revolution. An optimist, it was said, was someone who learnt Russian, a pessimist someone who learnt Chinese. The Soviet Union's stock then plummeted with the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, while in the early 1970s, after the advent of ping-pong diplomacy, the West embarked on the long love affair with the People's China, which lasted essentially up to the Tiananmen crackdown of 1989. The Soviet Union was now restored to relative favor after the coming of Gorbachev, and following his replacement by Yeltsin, hopes remained high that the new post-Soviet Russia would pursue a generally pro-Western course. Instead, the new Russia chose to make common cause with its old Chinese enemy, quietly building up year by year a political, military and economic partnership which has long since outlasted the much-vaunted alliance of the 1950s. The West was initially slow to react to this new phenomenon, but by the early 2010s, Russia and China were habitually bracketed as the awkward squad in international diplomacy. And by the early 2020s, the two powers, Russia still bristling with its Soviet nuclear arsenal, China incomparably richer than it had been half a century earlier and possessed of its own ever more high-tech armed forces and missiles, now posed a challenge that made comparisons with the Ottoman Empire seem a distinct understatement. The two powers have now come to be perceived as a kind of Eurasian Mordor, not merely confronting the West on land and at sea, in Ukraine or the Taiwan Straits, but threatening the internal security of Western countries through infiltration and the latest techniques of espionage and cyber warfare. Demonization, however, is not in itself a constructive response to the threat, and the close embrace between China and Russia calls for a rather deeper analysis. Over the years, I have glimpsed some of the inner workings of these two great countries from an admittedly privileged vantage point. As a boy in the 1960s and early 1970s, I accompanied my parents, the novelists C.P. Snow and Pamela Hansford Johnson, on visits they made to Russia as guests of the Soviet Writers' Union. This was not an exercise in fellow travelling, but reflected a deep conviction of my parents that in the conditions of the Cold War it was vital to maintain some kind of a dialogue, to persuade each side that not everyone on the other side had horns and tails. In the course of these visits we met a wide range of Soviet literary figures, Sholokhov, Simonov, Tvardovsky, Yevtushenko, Aksionov, to name just a few, from hardliners to liberals and eventual dissidents. We met one or two individuals we guessed to have murky pasts, and others who were good people by any standards. We found much common ground, and sometimes also fought our own corner in ding-dong arguments. Through these visits, I also had the opportunity to travel to far-flung parts of the country, including Central Asia, Siberia, and the Soviet Far East. I was sufficiently enthused by my experiences to embark on a Russian language course back at school in England. In the meantime, however, my attention was caught by that other great pariah nation, the People's Republic of China, which was just coming out of the shadows at the end of the Cultural Revolution and was evidently destined to play an increasing part in all of our lives. In my second year at Oxford in 1972, I launched into a degree course in classical and modern Chinese, and for 3 years following my graduation in 1976 to 1979, I worked for the Sino-British Trade Council, escorting Chinese technical study groups around the United Kingdom and British trade missions venturing into remote parts of China. It was a wonderful opportunity to observe this immense land emerging from isolation and taking the first steps on its road to power and wealth. I remember the contrast between the nominal heads of the Chinese groups, Communist Party appointees to a man, no women, monolingual and lacking any obvious knowledge of the technologies their delegation